they sometimes talk about the second generation of painters in Florence. It's not a true generation of, around 30 years or something. In fact, Fra Angelico probably isn't that much older than Masolino and Masaccio, maybe a little bit. We think maybe he was born in the late 1390s as opposed to, 1401 for Masaccio. But I'm going to show you two artists, first Fra Angelico and then Fra Filippo Lippi. Both, that you can see, the Fra means brother. They both are members of a religious mendicant order. We talk about brothers. And they are the artists that continue what Masaccio started, the continuation of many of these motifs. The person we're talking about is Fra Angelico. Now, that's what we call him, but that's not his original name. He was born late 1390s, some people say 1309, and he died in 1455. His name, his birth name, if you will, was Guido di Pietro. Guido, son of Peter. And then he joined the Dominican order at Fiesole. Now, Fiesole is a little town just outside of Florence in the hillside. And they had, the Dominicans had a monastery, a house there. And he took the name of Fra Giovanni. Many times when you enter a monastic order, you are required to change your name because you're becoming a different person, essentially, dedicating yourself to God. So Guido became Giovanni. But he was given, I could call it a nickname, he was given the name Fra Angelico, the angelic brother, because of his character. He's also known as Beato Angelico. Take a look at one of his works here, what we're talking about him. Beato meaning, of course, blessed. So he has been considered to be the blessed painter. I don't think it's a formal beatification, but it's just been applied to him for centuries. And I don't think they ever got around to making him into a saint. But certainly he was known as humble, pious, gentle. He has this character. He also is a very fine painter, and he continues the Renaissance style begun by Masaccio with some things that are unique to himself. Now, you might say that it took, it wasn't the next day when the artist began to assimilate the achievements of Masaccio and Brunelleschi and Donatello from the 1420s. But by the mid-1430s, we see Fra Angelico combining their discoveries with perhaps some of his own proclivities and some decoration. He's more decorative than Masaccio ever was. But it's within this context of deep space, believable space. Now, here we're seeing an altarpiece, and the picture that I had does not have the predella underneath it, but here we see this altarpiece of the descent from the cross, or the deposition from the word deposito, from Christ as being taken down from the cross. It dates from 1434, and it's in the sacristy of Santa Trinita in Florence. And it's commissioned by Paolo Strozzi. So it is a Strozzi altarpiece. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't there another Strozzi altarpiece in the sacristy at Santa Trinita in Florence? Yes, there was. From 1423. Gentile da Fabriano's work. So here, just about a decade apart. And it's always very interesting to compare these because you can see in that, 11 years, Gentile is working just before Masaccio's painting in the Brancacci Chapel. Fra Angelico has probably seen the paintings by, at least some of them, by Masaccio. And is it building on that legacy of deep, believable, illusionistic space, solid figures, etc.? So let's see what's happened. They're both painted for the same location. They have the same patron, Paolo Strozzi. And so they would have been side by side. And they're very similar in the way they're composed, too, you might notice, with the one large section with the three arches and then pinnacles above them. Incidentally, the pinnacles, those pointed sections at the top, in Fra Angelico's paintings are not by Fra Angelico. They're by another artist who was also a monastic artist. He's known as Lorenzo Monaco, Lorenzo the monk. And I don't think we have any documents that prove it, but some people think that Fra Angelico, he may have been Fra Angelico's teacher. And he does beautiful, graceful, sometimes almost lyrical paintings. Really a sense of beauty. But he didn't finish this. He died. And Fra Angelico, possibly his pupil, took over and painted the Descent from the Cross. Compared to Gentile's Adoration of the Magi, just before the Brancacci Chapel, 11 years before Fra Angelico's painting, you have some similarities. You have, as I say, a similar shape to the altarpiece. You have one scene which has landscape elements, and you have a crowd scene. And you both have some architecture, you have landscape, you have a crowd. How do they treat that? Well, we said with Gentile di Fabriano, you almost have a decorative surface where the ground line is very, very high. You see just a little bit of the gold leaf sky at the very top of the arches. And the figures seem compressed together, like there's not really enough space for them to go back in space. On the other hand, if you look at Fra Angelico's space, the figures form a kind of semicircle with this ground free at the bottom. And that leads us in, it's like they're not right up against the surface. They're going back into space. In fact, the horizon is much lower. And interesting enough, we don't have the gold sky here. We have the blue sky. We have trees silhouetted against it. We have clouds. We also have little angels up in the sky. And you have the depth of the buildings as though they are going back into space. And yes, when he has straight lines to show you, Fra Angelico can use something that's in linear perspective. So with Gentile, this low point of view where the landscape seems to go up and everything seems to be compressed into a shallow surface. There's a sense of space. There's a sense of surface. Where with Fra Angelico, there's a sense of space, as though the figures actually are going back into depth and as though there is room for them and they can turn and they're not crowded up. There's crowds, but they're not squished together. And of course, you'll remember with Gentile, there was such an emphasis on using real gold and beautiful patterns. Of course, appropriate in a sense because these are kings. Fra Angelico also uses gold in the halos and some touches in costuming, but certainly much less. And I don't think it was just because Strozzi was didn't want to pay as much or something for the gold. Times had changed. This more illusionistic style would now be the next new thing. And of course, we call it the Renaissance. So with Gentile, you have figures and costumes where you have elegant, sort of round-headed figures. The midwives have these, the midwife who's closest to the viewer has this meandering hem and rich pattern, and of course we see the brocades throughout the picture. We're not quite sure there are real bodies under some of those draperies. Mary, yes, but not all of them. But it's very soft modeling. In, for example, Mary and the Christ child. With Fra Angelico, you have ideal, once again, softly modeled figures. In fact, you may notice that he's using a lot of pastels for the clothing. Instead of adding black, what he's doing is using sort of the true color as the shadow, bright blue, or stronger roses, and pinks, the reddish colors. And then they get lighter. The highlights are this pale light blue or this pinkish tone. So he's using these pastels, but they are, which are beautiful. And the garments are somewhat, they're simplified in the sense of they're simplified, but you've got the sense of figures beneath them. They're not flattened at all. The figures can turn in space. And let me point out a few of these figures. We mentioned, I should also say there's pattern here too, but it's not pattern that obscures the space. I always want to call the ground, which has all of these patterned flowers in it. I want to call it sward rather than grass, or a poetic word. And so, Fra Angelico does have some decorative elements, but they don't overpower the solidity and three dimensions of the figures. The figure that is a little too, as we look at our right of center, Christ left, that's kneeling in this reddish garment, that is believed to be Paolo Strozzi. And you might notice that the people behind him, who are dressed in contemporary Florentine garment, in the place where the evil soldiers and Pilate and people who are tormenting Christ would be, are very quiet and contemplative, and they're holding instruments of the Passion, such as the nails with which Christ was nailed to the cross. And they seem to be meditating on them. It's been suggested that these are also portraits of Florentines, actual people who now are envisioning themselves at the cross of Christ, and the painter can paint them the vision. In fact, the trees seem to be very much what you might see around Florence. In the center, Christ's body is being lowered. You don't have that awkwardness or angularity if you think of, say, Pietro Lorenzetti's descent from the cross. It's ideal. It's beautiful. He's held in a way that emphasizes, I'd say, the beauty and the grace of the figure. You do have some extra male figures. The servants or other figures, contemporary figures. At any rate, they have a few others. And then Mary Magdalene is forming the figure that makes it symmetrical, as she's also in a reddish garment, also kneeling, but she, unlike Paolo Strozzi, is actually kissing the feet of Christ as he is lowered from the cross. And then you have in the lower right this figure of one of the Marys, one of the holy women, wrapped in voluminous drapery. She's not the stocky, bolder figure of Giotto. She's more slender, but she doesn't have all the little meandering curves and exotic details that the midwife, who's in the same position in Gentili's painting, have. Somewhat a simplified figure, but she turns into the composition. So we're facing the same way as these figures that turn into the painting. And so then you have this sort of group of the holy women, and in the space between Magdalene and the foreground figure, we have Mary. Mary is here kneeling. She's holding her hands in prayer. So once again, you have this feeling of prayer, of devotion, of meditation. It's very quiet painting, just filled with light and beauty. Solid figures. This open space in the foreground draws us in. We have a distant landscape that suggests the space continues onward. All the figures are modeled in clear colors of light and dark of the same hue, rather than just a decorative substance. Okay, let's look at some of the details so you can see a little bit more here. We have Mary kneeling. We have the Magdalene kissing the feet of Christ, the holy women. We have the men who are lowering Christ into John's arms. And you see how softly modeled Christ is. And then a little detail of the landscape and one of the other figures that may or may not be a portrait. One of the things that's interesting about it, it's very clear, it's very still, there's no haze or anything, there's a restraint of gestures, there's no blood and gore. Everything is still, peaceful, lyrical, pastels rather than strong hues. The most intense colors are Mary the Mother, who has a rich, deep blue. Mary Magdalene in red. John, who has some blue shadows. It's a little unusual. Usually John is in red, but then that probably would make too many reds right there. And then, of course, the kneeling donor, Paolo Strozzi, presumably, is in a strong red. And these figures do seem to form a kind of triangular form that is what leads you into Christ. You're not seeing strong, horrendous emotion, agony, suffering. You're seeing a scene of beauty and peace. This has brought about our salvation, and we are meditating quietly on it. Even Golgotha itself is a beautiful, almost tapestry of flowers on the ground. And so what we're seeing, of course, is the lessons of Masaccio in showing three-dimensionality added to and Fra Angelico's own perhaps gentle personality. His work is more lyrical, more charming. It doesn't have that force of Masaccio. No one's going to call him rough and crude, Tom or Guido or anything else. It has a devotional content. Here, we are kneeling at the scene where we're seeing Christ. And we can see the people who may be contemporary Florentines looking at the crown of thorns and the nails and meditating on those. So what you're seeing essentially is timeless devotion, not how it was and the suffering and the agony and we got to get him down for the cross and get him in the tomb or anything like that. It's timeless. We do have the gold disc halos. We might say, gee, isn't that a little old-fashioned? Well, not yet. Fra Angelico never gives it up, and it is rare when he foreshortens them. Little traditional element that continue. He does foreshorten them, however, sometimes you can see the figure at the top of the ladder has a foreshortened halo. And as we look at more works by Fra Angelico, I will mention one other thing, particularly when we get into paintings in the monastery of San Marco. There's a lot of rooms there. I'm not going to show you all of them. I'll show you some examples. But we do know that he had a lot of assistants. So sometimes if you were to look at the pictures of every cell in San Marco, you would see a variation sometimes in quality. Maybe his designs and somebody else painting them. he's not as interested, presumably, in his fame and that kind of thing. He can pass work on to the assistants. It is a devotional task. But and remember, this was for a secular patron. So, it's rich, it's beautiful, it's quite remarkable. This has suffered somewhat as far as some wear on it, but this is the San Marco altarpiece. Now, Fra Angelico, I should explain a little bit. I mentioned San Marco. San Marco in Florence. Of course, there's other San Marcos in the world. St. Mark in Florence. In 1436, the cloisters and chapel, the building of the monastery of San Marco, was acquired by the Dominicans of Fiesole. And it is suggested that Cosimo de' Medici, who was a great patron of this monastery, had something to do about that. Was a patron supplying some of the funds and some of the political clout to get the small number of monks, at another order, moved out so the Dominicans could expand into this space. In 1438, we know that Cosimo de' Medici contributed to the rebuilding of the church and the monastery, and his favorite architect, Michelozzo, who had designed the Medici Palace, is assigned to renovate the church and the monastery. We have a consecration date for the church of 1442. So we are assuming that this was finished before that. And Pope Eugenius IV was present. The Pope was there to consecrate this monastery. The prior of the monastery, later it became a canonized saint, Saint Antonine of Florence. And I think in your textbook you'll find lots of references to his writings and preachings. Those very notable people would have seen this, I guess. So this is the San Marco altarpiece by Fra Angelico. It would have been on the high altar of the Church of San Marco. It has been a bit overcleaned. And you might notice that you have a painting within a painting. Right down at the bottom, you have a little panel of the crucifixion with the gold leaf background and John and Mary standing beneath the cross of Christ. And it sort of is a repoussoir in a sense. It's it's almost like, okay, there's a real painting. Oh no, it's painted in the other painting. And you look, it sort of marks the space of the edge of the picture, and then you look behind it, and you have this wonderful carpet that is receding according to the laws of linear perspective. That's another example that Fra Angelico could use linear perspective. The kneeling saints are Cosimo and Damian. Now, Cosimo and Damian were physicians, and the word for physicians in Italian is medico, is one physician. Medici is more than one. Now, the Medici family were not physicians. They were bankers. They lent money at interest, usurers. But maybe the family did go back to some physicians sometime because the family name was Medici. And the two Medici saints, the two physician saints, are Cosimo and Damian. And so they are there, sort of testifying to the fact that the Medici had provided funds and patronage for this monastery. And you can see on one side of these rows of saints, you can see the Dominicans on our right as we look at it. The Dominican habit is this white garment with the black cloak over it. And we'll see a lot of Dominicans. And then we have other saints throughout time. He has used a completely consistent one-point linear perspective. There's the diagram to show 1 point and also 2 points in a sense. This is how it worked out. One of the subjects that he did portray a number of times was the Annunciation. And this is one that is in Cortona in the Diocesan Museum, the Diocesan Museum, 1432 to 34. There's another one that's very similar in the Prado, and then we're going to see how he painted the same subject within his own monastery. But these are panel paintings, tempera paintings on wood as altarpieces. And you can see this has a predella, and I'm showing you one of the details from the predella, which is the visitation scene. So you'll notice that he's used a loggia for the place where the Annunciation is taking place, a sort of an outdoor space, like a cloister or something, with a garden enclosed, is one of the titles that is sometimes given to Mary from the Song of Solomon. And the angel Gabriel has arrived. He's coming between the columns, so we can see the column in front and gives that sense of space. And the Virgin is very meekly and mildly accepting the word of God. Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. So nice little space cell, much more spacious than, say, Duccio's or Simone Martini's space cell. We've come a ways. If you look in the upper left, you see 2 figures, and this is the expulsion. This is Adam and Eve being sent out of the Garden of Eden. Now, Fra Angelico clothes them. They are not in the nude. You also have the pattern of the flowers on the ground. If we want to look at this scene of the Visitation, it's kind of interesting because he's expanded it a little to give you a vista going back into depth. And you also have these 2 interesting, I guess they're the maidservants, one who has accompanied Mary and the other who is in Elizabeth's house. The Visitation is when the Virgin Mary goes to visit her older cousin, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, who was thought to be barren, has now conceived John the Baptist, the cousin of Christ. And when they meet, John, they said that the child leaped in my womb. And this is supposed to be the child is acknowledging his cousin as the Savior, even in the womb. So the 2 saints are embracing. Little off center, so we can have this wonderful vista going back into space. You have the maidservant of the house sort of peeking, not about her business, supposed to see what's going on. And then this other figure of the woman carrying the bundle and climbing up the hill. You get the feeling of laboriously, that she's had to come up the hill, and she's slower. Maybe she's older than Mary, following her. And it does really get you a feeling that the space extends because it's been a hard, long climb there. Okay, these are some pictures I took at San Marco. They are the cloisters, and I want you to take a look at the columns. This is Michelozo's architecture, and you can see these columns with Ionic capitals. And you might also notice the second story, American second story, European first story, the little tiny arched windows. Each one of those is a cell for a monk to sleep in and to meditate in too. Now, this is a fresco. It's on the, and I'll use the American term, it's on the second floor. You have the first or ground floor, and then you go upstairs if you are one of the monks, and now if you're a tourist, you can do it too. You can go up the stairs to the dormitory. which goes a kind of square with all of these cells around the edges. A cell is a small room, essentially. They are generally groin vaulted, and you do see the groin vaults here. As you go up the stairs, the wall that is across the hall from the doorway that you enter from has this painting on it. It's a fresco of the Annunciation. And it has an inscription which translates, "As you venerate while passing before it the figure of the intact Virgin, beware lest you omit to say a Hail Mary." In other words, it's a reminder to the monks. You come up the stairs, you're reminded of the Incarnation. You're reminded of Mary, bearing the Christ child. And, you're supposed to, when you see this picture, you're supposed to say it, Ave Maria, gratia plena. Don't just get involved with all your other things. Keep thinking of your meditative spiritual purpose. So we have the inscription. We know exactly what it's used for. You're using, it's fresco, so you do often use very pale colors, such as the pink, the rose that the angel is wearing. You might notice the multicolored wings. The Virgin has a little deeper blue in her garment. She's humble. She's seated on a little wooden stool. And the angel has brought her the news. She has her arms crossed. She's accepting what God has planned for her, that she will bear the child. And you'll notice it's somewhat similar to the Cortona painting as far as the arrangement, but we see more into the loggia. And then when you look to the side, once again, I was going to say sward. I mean, you have this tapestry of patterned flowers on the side. And then very clearly the enclosed garden. There's a wall. And then we see trees on the other side of the wall. So reference to the intact Virgin, the enclosed garden, the hortus conclusus, refers to Mary's virginity in Exegesis. If you're really interested in the Giornata, someone has figured out how many days it took him to paint the painting, and you can see them all numbered. I'm not sure how he knew which one's which. I guess by overlapping, because they would be beveled, so that you could put the plaster over and it would adhere better. But you can see he worked a whole day on the head of the Virgin, on the head of the angel. Also, I want you to think about the architecture. The architecture looks like the architecture of the monastery. That's why I showed it to you. Of course, there are cells with groined arches, but the classical and classicizing columns reflect Michelozzo's architecture. And then just showing you some beautiful details where you can see the flowers, sort of the light green against the dark green, and the detail of the Virgin's head. Angel. And here you see differences, in a sense, between San Marco and the altarpiece at Catorno. Now, they're different media. Fresco for the scene in San Marco, tempera on panel, with much more use of things like gold. So the altarpiece is richer. It would be seen by people besides monks. The monastery fresco is private in a sense. Only the monks or their guests. For example, Cosimo de Medici did have a rather large cell in San Marco where he could go to meditate. And so, he would see it too, but generally this is for the monks. And you'll see that monastic art, as Fra Angelico creates it, you can think of the monastic virtues of poverty, humility, chastity. So they are not as splendid. They are meant for quiet meditation. There is, just to show you the one in the Prado, very similar. I think these colors are hyped here. Not that bright, blue. But you can see Adam and Eve, the Annunciation, the incarnation, when Christ first enters the womb of Mary. And Christ is the new Adam who redeems the sin of the old Adam. That's why the incarnation was necessary, because of the sin of Adam and Eve. Here they're a bit larger, being expelled from Eden. Now we want to look into one of the monks' cells at San Marco in Florence. And you can see from this picture, you can see there's this little window that opens into the cloister, and a little ledge below that. And painted on the wall is this fresco of the Annunciation. It's very important to think of who is your audience for a work of art. When Fra Angelico was painting for Paolo Strozzi, the richest guy in town, he used, beautiful colors, lots of decorative forms. But now he's painting for a Dominican friar. And so this painting would be for private meditation. It's a small meditative subject. Every cell, every little room for a monk to live in has a painting by Fra Angelico or his assistants. And you can see this is the Annunciation, but it's so much simpler than the altarpieces that we saw for Cortona. It's even simpler than the Annunciation that's painted on the wall, the fresco on the wall, right when you come up the stairs at San Marco, which everyone sees. And now we've gone into the cell, and the monk has this to contemplate. It's simple. We don't see a garden filled with flowers. We see groin vaults and just one column to the side. We'll talk about a figure there in a minute. So the architecture is very much like the architecture of the cell. Of course, there's no opening, but we do have the simple groin vaults. And so in a very real sense, the emphasis is on the simplicity and the purity and the humility of the Virgin. There's no decoration in her garment. She simply accepts the Word of God. Think of some of the other Annunciations we've seen, such as Ambrosio's Lorenzetti's, where she's frightened and she grabs the pillar, or Simone Martini's, where she sort of draws away. In this case, it is Mary who accepts the Word of God. She is humble, as the monk should be, and they can meditate on that. There's nothing to distract from the clear, simple meaning of the Annunciation. The angel and Mary. And there's one other figure. You can see a Dominican saint over on the left looking on. And his hands are together in prayer. And if we look a little closer, we can see who this is. You'll see that the top of his head is bleeding. It's been cut. And the blood is dripping down his forehead. This identifies him as Saint Peter Martyr, who was a Dominican saint who was martyred, who was killed with having his skull cloven with an axe or some kind of very sharp instrument. And he becomes the exemplar for the monk and the saint. Here we see the saint who is meditating on the Annunciation, as the friar in his cell should. And it's as though Fra Angelico has painted a vision of the Annunciation for both St. Peter Martyr and for the individual friar whose cell this is. Now, there are, as I said, in every cell, there is another picture. So I'm just going to show you a few. This one is Fra Angelico's coronation of the Virgin. And you'll notice that Mary and Christ are shown with white garments. There's a kind of round mandorla around them. Now, they are in heaven, and Christ is crowning his mother Queen of Heaven. But it's as though it is envisioned by all of these different saints. Now, I think I can identify most of them. There's one I'm not sure of. But 3 of them are Dominicans, as you might expect. This is a Dominican monastery. And they're the ones who are wearing the white garments with the black cloaks, so the black and white habits. And on the far left, there's one who has a sort of a full face. He's a little heavy. That's St. Thomas Aquinas. And then there is another saint dressed in black, and I think that's probably St. Benedict. And then we see, right in front on the left, a kneeling Benedictine saint. His hands are raised, and in his halo there is a star. Now that's the attribute of Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. The story, the legend, is that his mother saw a star at his birth, which marked him out as something special. Facing him, on the other side, is a figure in a brown habit, and if you look very closely, you may notice that he has the stigmata. That's St. Francis of Assisi. And I find it's remarkable that in a number of the cells, St. Francis is shown, and there's at least one where St. Clare is shown. These are Franciscan saints, and why I say it's remarkable is because the Dominicans and the Franciscans often were rivals. They were both mendicant orders, they were both preaching orders, and so sometimes the relationship between the individual monasteries or friaries was not the best. But think of it, Fra Angelico has that angelic spirit. He's not drawing barriers between the different orders. He's showing all of these monks of different monastic orders coming together and having the vision of Christ and his mother. And then you'll probably recognize him because you just saw him a minute ago. Right behind St. Francis is St. Peter Martyr, and you can tell once again because there's the blood on the crown of his head. And then here is another image. This one is the Noli Me Tangere. You'll remember that those are the Latin words for touch me not. And that is what Christ said to Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, after the crucifixion and the burial of Christ, comes the Sabbath. And after that is over, she returns on Sunday to anoint the body of Christ. Only she finds it's missing. And she's weeping, she's distraught, and she sees a man. She takes him for the gardener, because this tomb was in the garden. And she says, "If you have taken away the body of my Lord, tell me, where have you laid him?" And the man is Christ. And he says to her, "Mary." And she recognizes him, and she reaches out to touch him. And you see that that gesture of reaching out, of longing. I want to touch him. But Christ says, "No, don't do it. Touch me not. I have not yet ascended to the Father." So this is his first appearance to another human being, after his resurrection.